What is the best reality for my application? How do I decide if I create a virtual reality app or an augmented reality application? Think about your use case. Can your users sit on a chair and be immersed and completely disconnected from their environments and see a simulation for education purposes, for example? Then that's a very good VR use case. But if you have to have some kind of connection with your actual environments, then augmented reality should be your choice. A great example is if you are educating a surgeon for a surgery, that's a really good use case and that you can practice in a virtual environment. But when you're in a surgery room, you can't be disconnected from your environment totally, but you might need to have some relevant information in front of you about the patient. And that's a really great use case for augmented reality.
So, and we're back with James Ashley, who is going to talk about the dismiss gesture. I'm really curious what your talk is going to be really about, James. So the floor is yours.
Okay, thanks. Let me open with a sort of joke. Do you know how to tell the difference between a live broadcast and a recorded broadcast? I'll show you. Okay, so if this were a recorded broadcast, I'd go back later and fill that all in with cool Iron Man effects. And if this is not a recorded, but it's live, then they'll just really look silly. Okay, so let me go ahead and start in with my talk. I want to discuss the dismiss gesture with you today. So first of all, we'll step back a bit and ask, what is a gesture? And really, a gesture means two things. It's going to, on the one hand, mean basically a language, right? A way of communicating, usually with our hands. But more recently, it also means a way of interacting with devices. Initially, this started with the iPhone as a way of being able to close screens with our fingers and move on to the next step and things like that, which is also called the natural user interface. So it means these two things at the same time, and there's a little bit of collaboration between them, but also a little bit of tension. So the way I initially got into doing gestures was back in about 2010. I was working with the company Razorfish, and we we're doing a lot of work with the Kinect camera that Microsoft had just came out with. And I later wrote a book about the Kinect in 2012 with a colleague. And one of the great things about being able to work with the Kinect then was they had not come out with the toolkit yet. Originally, it was just intended for the Xbox, and some people inside Microsoft were planning to make this something bigger that can be used by developers, but by no means was that agreed on at the time. And in fact, even though they came out with the Kinect in 2010, they didn't come out with an SDK for it or a toolkit until about 2012. So between those two times, there was this amazing opportunity for anybody who's really into UX design to create their own gestures and not be beholden to anybody else, because suddenly we're working in a 3D environment, right? Rather than a touch interface like on the iPhone or touch screens. And nothing had really been created for it so far. So a lot of people were sort of duplicating what they'd seen on touch screens, and other people are trying to innovate and figure out new things. So there was that brief period where we had a lot of fun. And then in 2012, Microsoft came in and came out with a set of tools. And there was a little bit of tension, but the ultimate explanation was, if you're going to come out with a new interface, you have to at least standardize on a certain set of gestures so that people aren't going crazy and getting very confused about it. And one of the really fun ones, and it's one that changed a lot, was how to do a select. So because we're following WPF at the time and WPF types of graphics, the button, and it was a gel button, was really central to the interactions between the Connect and WPF apps. And so then the question was, well, what counts as a press on a button, a click? On a 2D screen, you would click on it. If it were touch, you would tap on it. But here we're tapping in the air. So the initial idea, and this had to do with some limitations of the Connect, was to actually just put up your hand. You would hover it over a button, and when you closed it, that would count as a select. An alternative way was you'd move your hand over the button and you would hold it there for a certain amount of time, usually about a second or two. And over time, what we discovered was that people got really frustrated with this, partly because the Connect would tend to lose tracking fairly easily back then. Second, because holding your fist isn't intuitive. It doesn't seem like a press. And holding for a long time is really irritating when you just want something to happen, but you have to wait for it to happen. And eventually, after about 6 months or so, we transitioned over to a different way of doing press. And it's exactly what you would think. You move your hand forward in order to press a button, right? So this is the beauty of working with gestures in VR at this point. We're sort of in that same period between 2010 and 2012 with the Connect, where people are inventing and experimenting with lots of new gestures. But also as a consequence, it's really useful to understand gestures a little bit better as we work through it. Okay, so back to the initial idea, what is a gesture? Well, partly a gesture is a symbol in an unspoken language. So you can imagine American Sign Language or variations of sign language, where you do things with your hands in order to communicate with other people. And we also have silent gestures. I'm trying to think of ones that aren't offensive. A lot of gestures that we use today tend to be. But so if you put your hand up like this inside a restaurant, usually a waiter knows that you're calling for them. And that's an instance of a symbolic gesture that's generally recognized in many places in the world. At the same time, over the past, let's say 15 years or so, we're also using gestures as a way to communicate with devices. And again, as we said initially, the big popularity came with the iPhone, where you had to have certain ways of closing applications, opening applications, doing selection, and so on. And we came to call these gestures. And part of the intent of these gestures was they should be natural. People, and this goes back to Apple's philosophy, and that's guided a lot of the gesture world, which is people shouldn't have to read a manual in order to understand how to use their devices. It should be intuitive. And so there was this notion that you would use gestures that people would be able to pick up on quickly or just intuitively grasp. And this whole movement became called the natural user interface movement. And really the best use of a natural user interface would be something where you could reuse gestures that are already being used out in the world. Falling short of that, you would try to reuse a gesture that's already being used in computers. So as I mentioned before, we have a button and you want to press it or click it. And that really comes from the Windows world where we have buttons and clicks. So another fascinating thing about gestures is what we name gestures, right? Here are some basic iPhone gestures, the very earliest ones: tap, pinch, zoom, and swipe. And the gestures tend to be named after the action that you do. And in a sense, it's after the semiotic gesture, what we already recognize in society before we even get into technology. So people know how to pinch without necessarily associating it with the iPhone. Swipe is the same way. Tap is the same way. Zoom is probably the strange one in this collection. I don't think zoom is a natural gesture. But I'm not really sure what we would call it. And always in the iPhone manuals or descriptions, there was a lot of trouble around what to call that particular gesture. So the tap in turn applies to a function, and the function of the tap is to select. The function of the pinch gesture is to make something smaller. The function of a zoom gesture, which is moving your hands apart, moving your fingers apart, is to enhance an image. And swiping allows you to move on to the next object in a series. Magic Leap was a competitor to the HoloLens from about 2017 until 2019, I'd say. And currently they're in hibernation, but it sounds like they're going to come out with a second device very soon, which is exciting. And they were late to get into gestures, but to compensate for it, they tend to have a greater variety of gestures than the HoloLens did. And you can see in general, they tend to name the gestures after what the hand movement looks like. So an L or a C or a thumbs up. The interesting thing about this is it's very dependent on the camera. So the gestures for the Magic Leap, I believe, tend to be things that the camera could easily recognize and that they could train their machine learning to recognize without too much trouble, rather than being something that's necessarily intuitive to anybody. For the HoloLens 1, there were two gestures that typically got used. And the first one was the air tap, which is still being used in the HoloLens 2. Very efficient. And you can see this sort of evolution moving from a click on a Windows machine to the tap on the iPhone to the press on the Kinect, and finally this air tap gesture in the HoloLens. And obviously one of the fascinating things about it is it's tied to the camera still. You have a camera on top of your device, and the best way to do a tap is to face your hand sort of to you so that the fingertips can be easily recognized by the camera. But of course, that's not completely natural. If you see something across the room and you want to tap at a distance, you would tend to point to it and do this. And the HoloLens can recognize it, but it tends to be more difficult to do. But probably the greatest gesture of all in the original HoloLens, and it's not in the HoloLens 2, I'd love to hear the story of why it's not in the HoloLens 2, was the bloom gesture, which is like this. First of all, it's really fun to do. And second of all, it's essentially a dismiss gesture. If you're already inside an app, this is how you would get out of the app. It doesn't necessarily close the app that you're in. What it does is it puts into hibernation. It throws you back to your central main screen of the device. But still, it's very, very cool. And so I've been really fascinated with the dismiss gesture for a long time. But the only place it really shows up is in this particular movement, in the real world, at least in real devices. But where it shows up a lot over the past several years is in sci-fi TV and sci-fi movies. You'll find the dismiss gesture all over the place there. And it's never quite the same thing from place to place, but it's always clearly recognizable and has become a trope in sci-fi. So what I want to do next is show you a rather long sequence of, for the most part, two shows. One is called The Expanse, and the other one is Star Trek Picard, where this gesture, the dismiss, is used frequently. And since this is a very visual medium, gestures are a visual thing, it's super helpful to be able to see these things in sequence in order to sort of grasp the variety and purpose of it. So I'm going to show a video. Hopefully it comes across well in the streaming, but fingers crossed there. Ugh.
Yeah, so James, you are not sharing the sound. You should have done that while you were going to share. So you could do that.
Oh, I can do it now?
Yeah, you have to stop the share and then share it again, but then there's a little tick box there that you can use to actually share the sound.
Let me try. Thank you. Thanks for that.
Confirmed that Sergeant Draper's power armor was subjected to massive concussive and incendiary forces, and the suit's internal data logs, as far as they go, are consistent with the MCRN's account of the battle.
The Martians wouldn't have given us the armor if it were otherwise. What about biologicals?
Well, we did find traces of various plant material, but again, that's consistent with the account. She was found in the wreckage of the Ag Dome.
I'm not talking about soybeans. I mean exotic biologicals. Anything that shouldn't be on Ganymede.
Sir, I'm not sure what you're getting at. We did a pretty thorough analysis.
I don't want pretty thorough. I want you to go over every goddamn molecule on that armor and tell me if there's anything you've missed. Do you understand me?
Yes, sir. Right away, sir.
This is Admiral Wynn. We have put down an attempted mutiny by Admiral Southern. All ships are ordered to return to the AO immediately and prepare to engage.
The communication signal.
Are crazy. They could be deliberately leaking, pushing us to the peace table.
Sir, that's not what's happening.
If this doesn't work, millions will die.
People are dying right now, our people.
La Serena, this is Free Cloud Orbital Control, confirming transfer of con.
Roger that.
Welcome, Captain Rios. I see your power conversion efficiency is only 91%. Remember, nobody knows the way around the Kaplan F-17 speed freighter like the Red Bull.
Kappa and Kappa, join the party at the Free Cloud Grand Hotel, afternoon high tea.
Come make it go away!
The Free Cloud Institute of Entertainment Robotics is now firing.
You have to punch it.
What?
Hit it as hard as you can.
I don't hit things.
Oh, no, he's right, Doc. You need to knock his head clear off.
Back architect. Submit your resume.
Oh.
Here with the Barba Piccola.
Refugee ship from Ganymede. One of the four that slipped through the ring before the blockade went up. They're never heard from again.
We heard from them again. The builders have been installing comm relays through the ring gates, prioritizing those 4 systems. The relays went live 2 days ago and started picking up broadcasts from 1 system. By some miracle, the builders in this world survived. About 100 or so. They're calling the planet Ilus.
Makes sense. Ilus was a brother of Ganymede.
It gives them.
It's getting kind of crowded out here.
Yeah. When the MCRN started hauling ass back from Saturn, the UNN sent the bulk of their outer planet assets burning hard towards them. Now, they're all headed towards Callisto. Transponder's going dark.
The MCR in shipyard. It's a critical base of operations.
That it is. But it has opened up a hole for us right here. See this course? This will get us to Io without anyone picking up our scent. A little bit of luck, we'll get in and out without anyone noticing.
Whoever's there won't know we're coming. But that's the only advantage we got.
Okay.
There's a 20-minute delay from the
Whoops. Okay, so hopefully that gives you a feel for how this particular dismiss gesture is being used inside of movies at this point. But again, just because it's being used inside of movies doesn't mean it'll necessarily work in virtual reality, for the simple reason that all that's happening is you've got a bunch of actors moving their fingers around in Iron Man type effects, and somebody else comes in later and makes it look like everything was intentional, sort of putting the cart before the horse in that case. But at the same time, there's something really valuable and interesting about this kind of gesture. In part, it's a way to do something very simple, which is just to dismiss a screen or to close an application. But there's this other really fascinating aspect to it, especially in TV shows, which is it's a theatrical gesture. And this is a concept that a senior UX lead over at Magic Leap talked to me about back in 2017, and he really opened my eyes to it, which is there are two kinds of gestures that you can use. One is theatrical gestures, and this sort of goes back to the Tom Cruise Minority Report type of gestures, where your arms would always be out and it would be very cumbersome. Definitely not something you want to use all the time because it's exhausting, but visually it's impressive and it communicates something if you've got multiple people sharing the experience with you. So not only are you closing something that's right in front of you, but you're making a show of closing it, sort of as a coda to whatever conversation you've been having up to that point. And that's also why you keep seeing this in TV shows, because it's a great way to end a scene. So theatrical gestures are something that do come up in VR and AR experiences and Connect experiences and so on. But they aren't something that you want to use all the time, right? There's also more efficient gestures. So I think, again, this was James Powderly who gave this example. Magneto in those Marvel Universe movies would constantly be doing really grand gestures when he's trying to make cars move and trying to make objects fly around the room. But you imagine that's not a gesture he always wants to use. Say if he goes into the restroom and gets up and flushes, he's not going to use his mental powers to flush. It's much more convenient, especially if nobody's watching, just to flush using the handle, right? So this is the essential difference between theatrical gestures and efficient gestures. You use them in different circumstances. So here's another great concept as you start thinking about gestures more, which is what's the difference between gestures as we're talking about them and also direct manipulation. This is something that Jamie Lee Blake taught me almost a decade ago. Which is, say on the iPhone, you've got two things happening. One is when you're doing something that's basically a flourish. So I would say swiping across the screen, and this is true of the Kindle too, is a flourishing gesture. And what's interesting about these types of gestures is you have to wait for the whole gesture to be completed before you know that it happened. And that's why there's always a little bit of lag when you're doing these types of gestures that are ultimately symbolic. Yeah. On the other hand, there's also direct manipulation, which is different from these symbolic gestures. A direct manipulation is always recognizing whatever movement that you're doing. So if you're on an iPhone and you tap on something, that's usually a direct manipulation. The reaction is immediate and the recognition is immediate on the touch surface. But other things, there are usually other gestures that are also direct manipulations. And if you ever worked with a Surface table, this was really common there, where most things were direct manipulation. And so you'd be able to drag things around the screen. And that always responded in real time. So the language I learned for this was gestures versus direct manipulation. But later on, I found another set of terms that were being frequented, which is offline gestures versus online gestures. And offline gestures would be the equivalent of what we were calling symbolic gestures, and online gestures are direct manipulations. And again, the difference is with offline gestures, you aren't paying attention to every point on the screen that somebody's touching when they're moving through a gesture. It's only when they've completed all the poses on the screen. Say if you're doing a swipe, you want to know that they started up one side, have moved across the screen, and have ended somewhere else. And when all those criteria are met, then the device recognizes that a gesture has been performed. On the other hand, an online gesture, for instance, dragging objects across the screen or dragging objects from one thing to another, is an online gesture because the underlying system has to be aware of where your finger is on a screen or where your hand is in front of you in volumetric space for the entire time. One of the interesting things is because there's this essential difference between online and offline gestures, and people tend to be beholden to them and use the controls that are built into operating systems to do one or the other, certain tasks suddenly, surprisingly, are difficult. And one of them is throwing. So throwing is interesting. It's as if you start direct manipulation and an object is moving around with your finger, but then you try to throw it off. What can happen then is that once you release your finger from the screen, the object you're manipulating just stays where you left it, even though your intention is that there should be some momentum that's imparted to the object and it continues its movement. And this is because you're doing the switchover in the one case, tracking your finger on the screen and automatically making an object always change its X and Y position depending on where your finger is. But when you release it, you don't have that information anymore. What you want to happen is to have the physics engine take over at that point. And depending on where you're moving prior to that, it should carry on the momentum, pass it on to the physics engine, and the physics engine will move the object based on that. But it requires a very smooth trade-off, a smooth handoff, which often doesn't occur. So if you look at a lot of Unity games, or their basic sort of walkthroughs of how to do a game, you'll find that this doesn't really work well, and it's much more complicated than you would think at first. And the really great example of throwing is in bowling, because you have a very clear sense, almost a physical sense, of somebody taking the ball, running with it, and imparting momentum to it, then adding additional momentum as they roll their arm forward and release the ball. And when we see this movement happen, we naturally expect the ball to continue moving with all the momentum that was imparted to it. And it would be really weird if the moment somebody let go of the ball, it just sort of hovered there in the air, even though this is something that can happen frequently inside of natural user interface applications, for this reason that this is an in-between gesture. So I want to talk about this because back in 2011, I was working with a company called Razorfish, and we had done an app called 5D. And at the time, it was really easy for us to do this throwing motion because we were working with the Surface table, which had an underlying toolkit where I think it was called the scatter control, automatically had this built in, where you can grab objects, you could directly manipulate them around the screen, but then you can also release them, and they would have the momentum at which you threw them initially. And it was very strange to have that when I started off working with WPF, and find out later that that's something that got lost from gestures over a period of time, just because nobody was really trying that very much. So hats off to the Surface Table team and whoever came up with the scatter viewer. And the app we wrote was basically a commercial app where, first of all, you would have a Surface Table in front of you, and you could take your phone, and when you laid it on top of the Surface Table, you can take any of the icons on the phone and sort of flick them off, and that object would appear on the table as if it had flown through the air and landed on it. And vice versa, you could take objects on the table and overlay them on the phone, and you'd see them transferred to the phone. And then another, actually a simpler one, but more essential to flicking, is we had this tie application where you could have a salesperson behind you and you'd be looking at a magic mirror display, and the salesperson would look through a bunch of potential ties, grab one from the tablet and toss them onto the screen, where, because we were using a Connect at the time, it would automatically find your neck and position the tie over your neck. So it's a proof of concept, but it was extremely fun to do. And really the funnest thing of all that we didn't realize is just how fun it is to flick objects across a room or from one screen to another. I think it was about a few years later that we started seeing the flick become more and more common inside of sci-fi movies, and also in just detective movies like Hawaii Five-0 would have people flicking objects and letters and documents from their phones onto these large wall-mounted screens. It feels good to flick, and it's kind of a cool concept. Anyways, going back to the idea. So what I was saying was, when I was working with the Surface Table, this was really easy to do because it was all built in. Then later with iPhone and other tools, there became the separation between direct manipulations and true gestures, or offline and online gestures, so that throwing suddenly became difficult. And it's worth pointing out that the one company that ended up doing it really well was Niantic when they came out with Pokemon Go. And I'm not sure if people took it for granted when they saw that they could pick up a bowl and throw it at an object. But the first time I tried that, I thought it was amazing because I hadn't seen that kind of flicking for about 5 years. And it's just really cool. Okay, so at this point, I want to talk about another thing about gestures. And this has to do, again, with the notion that when you flick something, you expect it to gain momentum and keep moving rather than just hover in the air. Or even worse, you flick it and it just sort of hovers and drops to the ground or something in a VR experience. And this goes back to a really important moment in the history of science, which is Newton's articulation of the third law of motion. So he says for every action, there's an equal and opposite reaction. And because we're familiar with it, we tend to assume that it's very intuitive and we all know what it means. But actually, there's a lot of debate about it because there's something inherently strange about it. One obvious thing he could be meaning is if you take a ball and throw it against a wall, it's going to come back with the same momentum that you threw it with, right? And so that's the equal and opposite reaction. But when he gives examples of equal and opposite reactions, he has some strange ones, such as when a horse is pulling a cart, the cart is also pulling the horse and holding it back. That's another example for him of equal and opposite reaction. And then another one is when you press against something. Say I'm pressing against my hand is pressing, but the thing I'm pressing against is also pushing back. And that's another instance of the equal and opposite reaction. So there's general agreement that there's something strange going on in Newton's third law, some bigger point that he's trying to make. And one supposition is he's talking about there's something different about the world than the way we understand it when we approach it mathematically. Before Newton, there's this sort of Cartesian notion of space that was very common. And in that, there are primary qualities and secondary qualities in the world. Secondary qualities are things like smells and colors and the feel of things. But primary qualities, for Descartes especially, was just pure extension and size. Anything that could be measured is the primary quality and the real thing, and everything else was just sort of affect. But for Newton, when he came along, discovered not just momentum and inertia and gravity and force, this realization that objects don't simply fall at the same rate, but accelerate as they fall. He had this notion that there's this extra thing going on where the world is always pushing back on you and affecting you. And the world affects you in a way that's different from your pure conception of how it's supposed to be. So that's all a little bit vague, I know. But just imagine doing gestures where we're all much more aware of things like momentum and inertia and the fact that the world is always affecting us as much as we're affecting the world. And so the example I really want to talk about is the HoloLens 2 manipulation rays, which for utility is absolutely great. If you're in the HoloLens, you get to shoot out 2 rays from your hand. And when they converge in an object, you can actually use them to position the object and move it around and rotate it and so on. It's a good experience and sufficient, but the thing missing from it is any sense of momentum or gravity, right? These lines are always straight. And even though you're picking up and manipulating objects, you're not going to have any sense of that. It's as if you're in a Cartesian world and not in a Newtonian world. What would be much more cool is if we're using these rays and these rays are actually affected by the objects that you pick up. And this, again, comes from some experiments that were happening at Magic Leap down in Florida, where one of their developers had come out with a sample app where similarly he had these rays that would shoot out from your hand and you could point them at objects that pick them up. But the extra thing he added was different size objects had different weights. And if an object is bigger, the ray would actually bend as you tried to pick it up. So efficiency wise, it may not seem very efficient, but as a pure experience and as something that we grasp intuitively because we know how to work inside of the world, this notion that you're not just shooting out rays, but you've got something more like a fishing pole that will bend as you pick up objects felt really, really good. And so the final point about the sort of next level in gestures that would be really wonderful to see is when you're combining theatrical gestures with the world of gestures that we already have, we're depending not just on being able to recognize the movement, but there has to be additional interpretation to understand the intent of the user. Because as you saw from the original videos, there are lots of different ways to close down an app. but it really depends on what the user means to do. Do they mean this to be a theatrical gesture and they want the application to close? Or do they want something smaller? Do they just want to move it aside so that they could do something else? And so to have a really next level world in gestures, we may need AI to be able to interpret faces and actions to determine what do people actually want when they're doing something. Okay, with all of that in mind, the notion of manipulations versus symbolic gestures, with the notion of theatrical gestures versus efficient gestures, the final test I want to do is try to run that sort of 7-minute video for you again and see if you look at it differently now with all these other factors brought in.
There's a 20-minute delay from the AO. By the time we get a full assessment, the hail and the Scirocco could both be dust. We have to anticipate the worst.
Phoebe's a backwater science.
Know that, will we? Sir, we precipitated this by sending a ship to Phoebe in the first place. They weren't firing on the hail. They intended to miss. A first shot across the bow.
Thank heaven Captain Yevgeny has a cool head, or we'd be already blasting each other's cities.
Data core and logs were purged, so we pulled whatever we could out of the flight operations system. We were sending you the design specs along with the DNA scans of the 13 bodies found on board. But get this, the ship has one of the fusion drives that were stolen from the Bush shipyards. We'll maintain position with the wreck, and we'll await your instructions.
Me? How is this my fault?
Chris, baby, he's an old man. How far is he gonna get? Now Picard's en route to a planet that's days away at maximum warp. Don't ask me how. And I'm tractor locked to a 4 cube full of Romulans. Damn it. Can't you hack the traffic control system? Rafi!
I'm trying! The underlying code's all freaky board with machine language. Just ask them to let us go. They don't want us.
Ours and the OPA to all rally together and start singing Kumbaya, do the right thing. Just hear me out, all right? Look, we're gonna launch the Nauvoo from here, okay? We're gonna shoot her like a bullet toward Eros, picking up speed. Fred's geeks crunched all the numbers: velocity, speed, angle, all that crap. So when she hits, Eros is on her merry way. We're going to detonate the bombs after impact. Controlled explosion that just destroys the docks and cooks the surface. Nobody ever gets in there again.
Revelations from the discovery of the wrecked stealth ship in the belt continue to reverberate Earthside. Today, UN sources confirmed that evidence aboard the ship has been conclusively linked to Protogen Corporation, a subsidiary of Mal Kwiatkowski Mercantile, and that all of Protogen's corporate assets have been frozen, pending a full investigation of the company's ties to OPA terrorists.
Get me Aaron right.
Confirmed that Sergeant Draper's power armor was subjected to massive concussive and incendiary forces, and the suit's internal data logs, as far as they go, are consistent with the MCRN's account of the battle.
The Martians wouldn't have given us the armor if it were otherwise. What about biologicals?
Well, we did find traces of various plant material, but again, that's consistent with the account. She was found in the wreckage of the Egg Dome.
I'm not talking about soybeans. I mean exotic biologicals. Anything that shouldn't be on Ganymede.
Sir, I'm not sure what you're getting at. We did a pretty thorough analysis.
I don't want pretty thorough. I want you to go over every goddamn molecule on that armor and tell me if there's anything you've missed. Do you understand me?
Yes, sir. Right away, sir.
This is Admiral Wynn. We have put down an attempted mutiny by Admiral Southern. All ships are ordered to return to the AO immediately and prepare to engage.
The communication said
Or crazy? They could be deliberately leaking, pushing us to the peace table.
Sir, that's not what's happening.
If this doesn't work, millions will die.
People are dying right now, our people.
La Serena, this is Free Cloud Orbital Control, confirming transfer of pod.
Roger that.
Welcome, Captain Rios. I see your power conversion efficiency is only 91%. Remember, nobody knows the way around the Kaplan F-17 speed freighter like the Red Bull.
Hasbro Kappa, join the party at the Free Cloud Grand Hotel, afternoon high tea.
Yeah, completely go away.
The Free Cloud Institute of Entertainment Robotics is now firing.
You have to punch him.
What?
Hit it as hard as you can.
I don't hit things.
Oh, no, he's right, Doc. You need to knock his head clear off.
Back architect. Submit your resume.
Oh. Here with the Barba Piccola.
Refugee ship from Ganymede. One of the four that slipped through the ring before the blockade went up. We're never heard from again.
We heard from them again. The Belters have been installing comm relays through the ring gates, prioritizing those four systems. The relays went live 2 days ago and started picking up broadcasts from one system. By some miracle, the Belters in this world survived. About 100 or so. They're calling the planet Ilus.
Makes sense. Ilus was a brother of Ganymede.
It gives a
It's getting kind of crowded out here.
Yeah. When the MCRN started hauling ass back from Saturn, the UNN sent the bulk of their outer planet assets burning hard towards them. Now, they're all headed towards Callisto. Transponder's going dark.
The MCR in shipyard. It's a critical base of operations.
That it is. But it has opened up a hole for us right here. See this course? This will get us to Io without anyone picking up our scent. A little bit of luck, we'll get in and out without anyone noticing.
Whoever's there won't know we're coming. But that's the only advantage we got.
Okay. So I apologize in advance. I just have to do this. Thank you for attending my presentation today. And you're all dismissed. No, just kidding. There's time for questions. Hopefully, I'll be happy to answer any that you have.
Thank you, James, for this interesting presentation. Feeding us with all these gestures, basically. So there were not really questions in the stream, but there started sort of a small conversation because one of the viewers actually said that once you had the audio on, it actually enhanced the gesture. So and then basically there was a question related to that remark, which was basically asking that if this audio cue was a confirmation for the user so that the gesture was accepted by the computer. And you hear all these, let's say, beeping and blinging sounds where, of course, in the theatrical way, and it's done because it really enhances the experience that you're looking at, but also in real life virtual reality type of stuff or augmented reality type of stuff, and this audio cue actually helps understanding that you did your gesture right, first of all, and secondly, that the system is going to respond to it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a fantastic point. Absolutely. Along with the recognition that a gesture has occurred, it's important to have an affordance, and audio affordances are fantastic. And affordance is basically something visual or audio or both that lets you know that you can interact with an object and something's going to happen. And the most familiar one is probably when you take your mouse cursor and hover over a button and the button changes its shape, right?
Yeah.
That's fantastic affordance. And you're right. You want to be able to, I mean, a perfect affordance will tell people that you can do something before you do it. It tells you are doing something as you do it. And when you're done, it tells you that you successfully completed it also. Yeah.
Very cool. Very cool. So there are no further questions. I don't have any questions currently. It was a very clear talk. Thank you for that on behalf of the organization, and I hope to see you soon again.
I would love that. Thank you.
All right. Bye.
Take care.